This podcast is sponsored by Demode Records. Welcome to a Fish Out of Water podcast. This is your host, Richard Altman. Today, we are interviewing Richard Wright. This is part 3 of this podcast. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much. Is there anything you'd like to add? What are your hopes for the future? Where do you think developments are happening? You know, we've got wars from every side now. I mean, some people are worried that it could be World War III, you know, if America and Russia get involved, God help us, you know. And everyone else.
I think, no, I mean, Richard, very, very good question. I just fear we're unlearning the lessons of the past. You know, the international system, international law, humanitarian law based on the Geneva Conventions, human rights law, all this was set up by essentially under the auspices of the United States at the end of the Second World War. Why was this done? Because the world was totally opposed to any possible repetition of what happened in Germany and the Holocaust. That was I would say the foundational drive behind all these things. We're unpicking it, we're undoing it. And you know, Israel is not respecting international humanitarian law in Gaza or in the West Bank. You know, Palestine, Hamas killing civilians, the same in Israel, the same. And all throughout the whole region and beyond, you know, Russia and in Ukraine. If we unpick this whole system, which has been the foundation of our prosperity in many ways since the Second World War, we're heading into really dangerous territory. That's my view, and I think it's a huge mistake. It's a huge mistake for Israel, which you know, is in many ways a thriving modern country, but is not currently acting in a way restrained by international legal norms. It's a big mistake for the United States, which is undermining, in my view, its power. It's just bullying itself around, acting as a you know, as a state, a sort of nationalist state, thinking only about itself. Power comes before law, and all this stuff. It's very dangerous, and I don't envisage it'll lead to a Third World War. But if we go back to the law of the jungle, then we risk going back to experiencing things that have happened in the past that we never wanted to see happen again. So, you know, there needs to be a collective wake-up call about the need to respect and apply international norms, international law in all its manifestations. It's not perfect. It's absolutely not perfect. It can be improved, no question about that. But let's work to make it better rather than to unwind it and unwind it by force and ignoring the lessons of the past. And it's civilians, you know, it's ordinary people who suffer. You know, something like over 20,000 children have been killed in Gaza. I mean, this is just simply unacceptable by any norm. You cannot, you know, have a situation where this sort of thing has happened. And children are being killed in the Lebanon now. Iran is on things in the past, and you know, this has to stop. And you know, otherwise, if there is to be war, then it has to follow the laws of war, and one of the primary goals of the laws of war is to protect civilians at all times, and that is just simply not happening now. So my message, or my firm belief, is that let's not collectively throw away all the lessons of the past, the hard lessons and the experience and what happened in the past. We don't want to see a repeat of this, but it will, you know, atrocities will recur unless we stick to our principles and norms. And it's more necessary than ever. And I have to say, you know, the way the world is going right now, I don't see it. If a country, Russia, invades Ukraine, this is a direct violation of the sovereignty of a UN member state, which, you know, voted to become independent after the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is a violation of Article 2 of the United Nations Charter, you shall not acquire territory by force. It's very simple. It's nothing complicated. It's a direct violation of the United Nations Charter. And I can go on with many other examples. Are we going to tolerate this? I mean, are we going to accept this? Because that's the way in which the current world is progressing. As a former EU official, the whole European Union is founded on the basis of the need to get countries to cooperate and work together, and to, above all, to promote peace. And the European Union itself is struggling with all these concepts. So there's a massive amount of work to be done. I'm not saying that we just stick rigidly and put our head in the sand and pretend everything was great in the past, because it wasn't. But let's be very careful about the way in which we allow current attacks on the foundational pillars of the international system. It's hugely dangerous. Nobody will benefit from it. They might benefit in the short term, but in the long term, everybody will be worse off. And I think it's extremely dangerous, and we need to stop it.
You mentioned the law of the jungle. What is the law of the jungle?
Well, I think it's every man for himself. It's going back to states pre-First World War, acting on their own, acting through, power relationships. That's what we're seeing, isn't it? I mean, the United States, Russia, China. China is fairly quiescent for the time being, but overhanging, there's this threat of a conflict over Taiwan. Israel's exerting its power throughout the Middle East. I mean, meantime, international legal norms are just basically ignored. And we have to stop it. The powers, there was this famous speech by Prime Minister Carney of Canada at the Davos gathering in February, and he said that medium-ranking world powers need to come together and form essentially alliance, or strengthen an alliance to uphold these norms and values. And I think he's right, because if the United States and other powers don't do it, then we have to step in and see what we can do as like-minded countries. I just came back from a private visit to Japan. I mean, Japan's another country which finds itself in this sort of the middle power rank. South Korea, Australia, Canada. I mean, these are all like-minded countries for most European countries, and I think we should work very closely with them to preserve the key founding blocks of the international system, because it's in our interest to do so.
What about Africa and parts of Asia and Latin America? What's their view on what do you...
I don't really... Look, I mean, I'm just, of course there are other countries in Africa and Latin America could also be part of this group, but I'm just really talking from a sort of traditional Western countries perspective. But no, I mean, it's certainly in their interest as well. I mean, I don't think that they're going to gain anything from a power grabs or, action which is, opposing international law. I mean, Sudan is another example where there's, today there's dreadful things happening. Well, we will have to see, but right now it doesn't look great. And in our country, in the United Kingdom, we're certainly a sort of medium power, and we can't do things on our own. We have to work with other countries. Leaving, as a former EU official, I'm bound to say, Brexit was a complete and absolute disaster economically and politically. But I think there's a growing realization now that Britain has to re-engage with Europe.
Why is that? Why is that? Why is that?
Because we're geographically close, we have like-minded principles and values, and it's our interest, economic and political, to do so, and it's already happening, actually. I mean, it's happening, it's happening economically, because we're trying to get closer in terms of better access to the market that we left. And just to remind anybody that needs reminding, it was the Conservative former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was the one who was the driving force of the EU single market, which, because she wanted, her vision of Europe was of a Europe of unified markets in which British business would benefit. And yet it was the Conservative Party which was in the driving seat in pulling us out from Europe 30 years later. A massive mistake. So Britain needs to re-engage with Europe, and which is beginning to happen now, too slowly in my view. But
and there were two sections today in Britain, like there's the mainstream parties, but then there's sort of other parties which have become more popular. The Reform on one side, and then you have the Greens. And what's your opinion on that? They have totally opposing view. For example, Farage would say that Britain's economy is doing better than it was if it had stayed in the EU. What's your opinion?
Well,
and the Greens would say probably, I'm not quite sure what their policy is.
Look, I mean, all serious economic analyses, whether it's the British Treasury, the Bank of England, the IMF, the OECD, and more recently National Bureau of Economic Research in Washington, have all shown that there has been a big hit from Brexit. The cost, the amount of it may vary, but the last one from the NBER in Washington was that Britain's economy has suffered a 6 to 8% hit from Brexit. Now, that, in GDP terms, I mean, that is big money. That's, in terms of government receipts, is sort of £100 billion plus. I mean, if we had £100 billion plus in the budget, the current government would be able to do a lot more than it's currently able to do. So I think the economic arguments that were put forward by the Brexiteers were just a pack of lies, to put it very simply. There was fantasy stuff. The big argument was, the real argument is on immigration, but even on that, I think there's a softening view in Britain. And this country needs immigrants. And immigrants have essentially been well integrated, in my view, into the country, and certainly European immigration from Europe, which was quite significant at one point. It was not a threat to the country, but rather brought a lot of benefits. So I just simply, this economic argument for me is nonsensical. The political argument is that Britain, we've lost influence in the world and in Europe as a result of not being incorporated in the club, if you like. And I used to work for 4 or 5 years in a committee preparing meetings of foreign ministers. Britain had when Britain was a member, Britain had a massive influence. We had very good foreign ministers like David Miliband and William Hague from 2 different parties, but then they had influence, they were listened to. We don't have that anymore. They're not at the table. It's a huge, huge mistake. If we were in Europe, Europe would be stronger and Britain would be stronger. I have no doubt about it at all. And we will re-engage on worse terms than when we left.
Thank you very much. I'm going to make one more phone call and then I think we'll wrap up. Thank you very much. Final words.
Final words?
Yes.
Me or you?
You.
Well, I think I've just about said it all. No, I perhaps just to finish by I think everybody who works in this, going back to Israel-Palestine and Middle East, everyone who works in this field feels has a sort of stake in it. You can't sort of work for UNRWA and probably other organisations and just walk away and forget about it. It's very much part of your DNA, and I think my overriding wish is for some political progress to be made, but as I said, it'll require enlightened leadership and statesmanship, which is in short supply, if non-existent right now. That's what I really find distressing. I would like to say, I'm certainly in a modest way, but like to contribute to that. As I say, we are in a group petitioning or urging the European Union to take a more active role and take a more active stance. But right now, I have to say, Richard, with all humility, that I'm not hugely optimistic that they were going to see much progress in the next few years.
What would the Israelis and Palestinians have to agree with in the first instance?
No, I think they've got to agree on 2 states. I mean, let's remember 157 out of 194 UN member states have, recognized Palestine as a state. Of course, the materialization of that state is not doesn't exist because of the conflict. But so 84% of the world states recognize Palestine. What has to happen? I mean, there has to be an agreement on, land rights, security, which is paramount for both sides. Often we hear about, Israel's security concerns, which are valid, but also equally valid for Palestinians. There has to be, a political agreement to share, as we discussed, a very limited geographical space to which both sides have claims. Has to be a renunciation of violence and terrorism, etc., etc. So there's an awful lot that's got to be done, and a serious process begun towards that end. But it's just not happening. And my argument would be, as the days go by, that it just gets more difficult. It doesn't get any easier.
But who would supervise all of this? What if there were breaches? Let's imagine that there were 2 states.
Well, then you have to have, Richard. I mean, breaches. You need some form of, say a UN, a UN military force, or just like something like you're going to need in between Ukraine and Russia. You're going to have some form of neutral force with a mandate to act and prevent a breach. I mean, it depends on the scope of the mandate. But I mean, no, you're right. Of course there can be breaches, but they're breaches now, Richard. They're breaches now. Settlers are roaming around threatening Palestinians. That's breaching. That's breaching law. I mean, Hamas attacked civilians and military and police targets in Israel on the 7th of October. That's a breach, of law, particularly with regard to civilians. But you can't say, well, what if there? I mean, if there are breaches, there are breaches all the time. I mean, if there was some sort of political understanding and political settlement, then maybe there should be less breaches. But I mean, the 2 sides have just got to, if there is to be a solution, they just have to accept a basic understanding of what the configuration of the territory will look like, etc., etc. And they're just nowhere near it.
Are there any leaders that are near it?
I'm sorry?
Are there any leaders that are near it, that have a vision?
Not in my view, no.
Is there anyone that has a vision?
I think there's a vision. I mean, I think there are people with visions, but I mean, how? I don't think I haven't heard, and maybe there are my lack of knowledge. I haven't heard of anyone with a serious plan about how to move a political process forward at the current time. I mean, there's wars going on out there. It's not the time where this is going to take place. There have been efforts in the past, of course, Oslo Accords, and then during the Obama time, John Kerry, the Secretary of State, made efforts to try and move things forward, but it all sort of ended, without any permanent solution. And now we find that the arrangements, in West Bank, the areas ABC now are under threat because of encroachment by settlers. This is not a solution. This is just going to create more conflict for everyone, and it's not a good thing.
Right, Richard, thank you very much for the
insights. I think I've run out of things to say. Thanks very much for your time, Richard. Nice to see you.
Thank you for listening to a Fish Out of Water podcast. This is your host, Richard Lippman. Should you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please get in touch. This podcast is sponsored by Demode Records.